the Gaza massacre is really an eye opener. In fact, on the one hand, it actually is deliberately asserting, or deliberately impressing upon the world's opinion the degree to which imperialism would go. And that is a way of terrorizing the world, because obviously the crisis cannot be resolved within neoliberalism. It is only the left that can go beyond neoliberalism, and that is why the coming of the left to prominence is something which, to my mind, is what is going to break the current deadlock.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. We're living through a moment of deep crisis for global capitalism, where imperialist powers are scrambling to maintain their dominance. The US finds itself caught between a collapsing liberal order and the rise of alternative economic and political formations that threaten its hegemony. The financialization of the global economy, the failure of sanctions against key adversaries, and the growing contradictions within the neoliberal model have fueled instability, not just internationally, but also within the core of the empire itself. Donald Trump's return to the political stage has intensified these contradictions. While his foreign policy has often been dismissed as erratic, some argue that it represents a strategic, if desperate, attempt to rescue US imperialism from crisis. From economic warfare in the form of sanctions and tariffs, to military brinksmanship from Yemen and Gaza to Ukraine, the shifting strategies of Western powers reveal the growing limits of US influence. At the same time, the assault on working people, economic, political, and ideological, has only deepened. The neoliberal system that created today's crises now leans increasingly on authoritarian and far-right tendencies to sustain itself. The collapse of the liberal center has left the world at a crossroads between socialist alternatives that challenge imperialism and capitalism and reactionary movements that intensify the system's worst tendencies. To discuss all of this and more, I'm joined by Prabhat Patnaik, a Marxist economist, professor emeritus at JNU, and author of many books, including A Theory of Imperialism and the more recent Capital and Imperialism, Theory, History, and the Present, both co-authored with Utsa Patnaik. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. If you want to support independent media challenging mainstream propaganda, become a Breakthrough News member and access the full episode at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode to help us get the word out. Prabhat, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Well, there's so much to talk about. You've been writing a lot of really important pieces, as always. So I want to try to get through of some of the important themes and topics that are relevant to what we're seeing take place right now internationally, but also emanating largely from the US. And in a recent piece that you wrote called Imperialism's Revival Strategy, you argue that Trump's foreign policy, which is often perceived as erratic or framed as erratic, is actually an attempt to extricate imperialism from a crisis, using this kind of carrot and stick approach. Can you elaborate on this strategy and how it differs from the approach of perhaps previous administrations?
Yes, you see, there is no question of Trump being a man of peace, because look at what he's suggesting about Gaza. So that, he is an imperialist out and out. So, given the fact that he is an imperialist, how is it that he is suddenly asking for peace in Ukraine? To me, it appears because of the fact that the Ukraine war has run into a situation where the kind of Western victory is completely impossible. That the objectives with which NATO had entered the war are objectives that simply cannot be fulfilled. unless there is such an escalation of the war that it may actually lead to a third world war, or it may lead to even a nuclear confrontation. So, what he's trying to do is to actually extricate imperialism from that situation, which is very tricky, and instead to pursue a more kind of, a more, from his point of view, practical, rational imperialist policy. So I think it's completely wrong to think of him either as being crazy or mad or anything, or as a person who's committed to the cause of peace. On the contrary, I think he is an out and out imperialist who is actually trying to pursue an imperialist policy that is more practical and more rational.
With that in mind, sanctions, which is something you've written about quite a bit, have devastated many countries, right? They've devastated Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, but they've largely failed against bigger countries like Russia, for example. And in Russia specifically, they've even spurred this kind of alternative global economic formation or formations, things like BRICS, right? That challenge or have the potential, I should say, to challenge US dollar hegemony. So, what does this tell us about the long term effectiveness of sanctions as an imperialist tool? And then, where do Trump's tariffs fit into this kind of sanctions paradox? Do they complement or contradict this policy of U.S. economic warfare?
You see, sanctions are quite effective against small individual countries. But I think if you have sanctions, as you said, against a large country and also against a large number of countries, in that case, those countries are likely to come together. And particularly a country like Russia, which has a fairly diversified economy, which moreover has adequate amounts of gas and oil, which it exports to Europe. So sanctions against Russia are not necessarily going to be very successful. And what is more, if you have sanctions against a large number of countries, then they can come together. In fact, that's exactly what was happening. All this talk about de-dollarization was basically a way in which countries like Russia or China and so on would actually like to see the world economy develop, when the hegemony of the dollar is something which is kind of, reduced. And in this venture, given the fact that currently there are a lot of countries of the global south who are debt stressed, the attraction for them to join an alternative arrangement would be all the greater. Therefore, the point is that, again, this links to the first question you had raised, that that the US was actually putting itself in a position where increasingly it was actually consolidating the forces against it. And in a sense, what Trump is trying to do, to use the carrot and stick method, is to extricate the US out of that position. On the one hand, he says that de dollarization is something that is going to invite penal provisions, in the sense that he's going to put huge tariffs on countries that even talk of de dollarization. And on the other hand, he is trying to break the possible unity of forces against the US by taking Russia out of this.
Yeah, I mean, so then to bring it to the issue of the tariffs, where do Trump's tariffs fit into this sort of this economic bullying that we've talked about so many times?
Well, I think we have to look at the tariffs somewhat differently, because the tariffs, of course, economic bullying is one motivation for tariffs, but there is something more. You see, basically, if you look at the 1930s, fascism in the 1930s had succeeded in overcoming unemployment, in overcoming the Great Depression. Japan was the first country to come out of the Great Depression, and Germany, after Hitler came to power, came out of the Great Depression. How did it do so? It came out of the Great Depression by using the weapon of the fiscal deficit to enlarge massive armaments expenditures. Exactly the same happened in Japan, same happened in Germany. Now, in today's world, the fiscal deficit as a weapon is ruled out because finance capital doesn't like a fiscal deficit. And particularly because finance is globalized, while countries constitute to have nation states, the ability of globalized finance to dictate terms to nation states is much greater. If a country does not do what finance likes, it simply leaves that country. And therefore the power of finance today is much greater because it's globalized, because of which the ability of the various governments of the nation states to extricate their economies out of the situation of unemployment and growth slowdown is much less, because after all you can generate additional demand. If suppose the government spends $100, and if it raises the $100 by taxing the working people who consume more or less the $100, then all that is happening is a change from one form of demand to another form of demand, no net increase in demand. Net increase in demand occurs only if the government can finance its expenditure either through a fiscal deficit, then you're not taxing anybody, or alternatively, if the government finances it by taxing the rich, who actually save a fair proportion of their incomes. Now, in a situation where both these latter options are ruled out by finance, financiers are the richest, they don't want to be taxed, and a fiscal deficit is something that finance does not like. And since finance is globalized, no nation state can dare to adopt these ways of financing larger government spending, because of which the ability of these countries, even when they have neo fascist governments, to get out of the crisis is much less. I mean, it's virtually non existent. Because of which, what we have is a world economy in which demand cannot increase, but on the other hand, if Trump has to prove himself to the American people that he actually has enlarged employment or he has enlarged the level of activity, he does so only by imposing tariffs. Tariffs are what are called a part of a beggar thy neighbor policy. That basically, I snatch markets away from you, and therefore I generate employment in my country, and therefore I export unemployment to your country.
Mm.
Therefore, it's a beggar thy neighbor policy that works only when the others do not retaliate. But on the other hand, if the other countries retaliate, then of course, all countries, suppose the US imposes a 10% tariff and the rivals also do the same, then you're back to square one. All that has happened is that the prices have risen relative to money wages, which basically means that actually the crisis has become even worse. So, if everybody does this, if there's retaliation, then the world ends up being in a worse position than before. But of course, it can work for a particular country. There's no retaliation. Trump
Mhm.
is trying that out, but on the other hand, he is not succeeding. But the whole problem arises because of the hegemony of globalized finance capital.
I wanna move to the issue of war and peace. You have described Trump's effort to end the war in Ukraine not as a pursuit of peace, but as a way to protect imperialist hegemony. So, how does his strategy differ from Biden's and from European elites?
Well, the point is the European elite has still not recognized the fact that the NATO venture is not succeeding. Of course, they are using this as an excuse to rearm Europe. I mean, in Germany, for instance, now there is an attempt to rearm Germany. And what is more, there are German troops stationed in Lithuania. So, for a very long time, Europe proceeded on the assumption that they would be protected by the US security umbrella. They do not need to raise their military expenditures. But on the other hand, now Europe is rearming itself. Certainly, Germany is doing, and even France and Britain are trying to raise their armaments expenditures. Now, the point is that this is certainly not going to get them anywhere as far as the Ukraine war is concerned, because they are not going to succeed as far as that goes. But on the other hand, it is something which actually, on the would benefit the armaments producers, Rheinmetall, for instance. It would benefit various multinationals. And the man who has just become Chancellor of Germany is a person who was working for BlackRock. I mean, he's actually a corporate person. So it'll benefit, if you like, the armaments manufacturers, uh, not all of them European, a lot of them are Americans, but it would benefit them. And at the same time, to the extent that it can be taken out of the fiscal deficit limit, in other words, I believe that in Germany an effort is made that 500 billion euros, uh, that that the fiscal limit can be eased in Germany by a certain amount for arming Germany, and that would be a net increase in expenditure. You see, because then you don't have to tax anybody, because then even if you cross the fiscal limit, which is put by the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is 3% of GDP, you would still be allowed to do that. If that happens, then this might generate some employment. But on the other hand, it is a very, very dangerous tendency, because obviously, all this talk about defense, Russia is not going to invade Germany. I mean, I think this is just a way of Germany rearming itself and attempting to become once more a major military power in the world. And I find that quite frightening.
I think there's good reason to find that quite frightening given recent history. Um,
Absolutely,
and
absolutely.
I think it's really important that you make the point about the fact that Europe was never truly threatened by Russia to begin with, and that
Mm.
this idea of Russian imperialism is a myth that's just used to continue funding and arming NATO, this military expansionist power that's America's tool in Europe.
Oh, absolutely. You see, people don't know that there was even a time that Russia mooted the idea of becoming a member of NATO. When Clinton was president, there was even a suggestion that Russia might join NATO from the Russian side. And Clinton, in fact, said, sorry, that is not possible. So the point is that the idea of Russia threatening Europe and threatening NATO is just absurd. It's completely childish. But on the other hand, it is something which is being used to kind of persuade the people in these countries to fall in behind a government policy of aggression and rearmament.
And speaking of the aggression and rearmament, I mean, Trump. I covered the election, and one of the things that his campaign did is they had this tagline specifically targeting the Arab and Muslim American communities, saying that Trump's whole idea for how to deal with the world is quote unquote peace through strength. We're going to, they were saying we're going to end the war in Gaza. We're going to end the war in Lebanon. There's going to be no more new wars. And I mean, I never believed this. A lot of people never believed this, but some people actually did and were so desperate to see the genocide in Gaza end that they bought into it. And now what we see is Trump isn't just green lighting and rearming Israel to continue its genocide in Gaza. We're recording this, Prabhat, just a few hours after Israel has restarted its vicious bombing campaign across Gaza. They've killed 430 people in the course of 12 hours, the vast majority of them women and children, just pure mass murder. And Trump is applauding it and saying there's more to come. Meanwhile, the Trump administration has launched a huge escalation against Yemen with a massive bombing campaign. And with that bombing campaign, they're threatening the Iranians and saying they hold Iran responsible for any actions by Ansarullah in Yemen, which has implemented uh, this blocking of the Red Sea ships that are coming from the U.S. or Israel or for the U.S. and Israel until the genocide in Gaza stops. Um, And it just seems like this could spiral even worse than it already has. And he's promising more aggression. So I guess my question is, how do you fit all of that from the so-called peacemaker, quote unquote, into the context of the sort of imperialist revival strategy that we're talking about?
Yes, you see, basically, when he says peace through strength, what he means is that you accept imperialist hegemony and there'll be peace.
Mm.
So it is actually peace through and accept. I mean, what he's suggesting is a peaceful acceptance of imperialist hegemony, because even the Gaza peace accord is one that is accompanied by a vision of the people from Gaza either being settled somewhere else, and
Mm.
Gaza becoming the location of real estate and tourism and so on, financed by various American companies. So the point is that that is a notion of peace, which is not really peace through negotiations, peace through settlement, but peace through domination. And that's really a completely imperialist notion. I mean, that's literally Pax, you accept Pax Americana. That basically you accept US hegemony and we'll give you peace.
I mean, it's really incredible. It's basically submit and you'll get peace. And what does peace mean if it's imperialist hegemony? It just means constant dying and shorter
Absolutely.
lifespans, anyways. Um,
Absolutely.
so I wanna ask you about this global assault on working people, which you've also written about you in this article that's literally titled "The Worldwide Assault on Working People," and you describe today's global assault on working people as having three prongs to it: economic, political, and ideological. Uh, what distinguishes this moment from previous capitalist crises, and why do you emphasize the ideological aspect of that assault I mentioned?
Well, I'm contrasting this to the immediate post war period. You see, much of my youth was really spent in Britain at a time in which social democracy was dominant, in which there was this view that there's a new capitalism, that there is a humane capitalism, a welfare capitalism, and so on. And I think that really, I mean, even though me coming from the global south, and me being a witness to the Vietnam War, did not really accept this idea of peaceful welfare capitalism. Nonetheless, there was no doubt that within its own territory, capitalism did bring about a significant change in the position of the working class, and of course, in strengthening democratic institutions. And that is something which was ideologically used all over the world to say that, look, here you are, the communists have authoritarian states and so on, while we are having peaceful democracy and so on. But the point is, the contrast to that situation is really quite striking. The economic assault on the working class is very clear. In fact, Joseph Stiglitz has made some calculation according to which the average real wage of a male American worker in 2011 is actually marginally lower than in 1968 in absolute terms. So that, this is really quite striking. Uh, and of course, in the third world, or in the global south, the real wages remain stuck to a subsistence level. If anything, they decline. They have been declining because of the fact that the reserve army of labor keeps growing as a part of the labor force. So, for both these reasons, the economic attack on the working people, not just in the global south, even in the metropolitan countries, is really quite clear. Similarly, the political attack, the neo-fascism that is emerging everywhere. Neo-fascism is emerging in global south, is emerging in the global north. You have Trump as a neo-fascist. You have Milei in Argentina. You have Meloni in Italy. You have Orban in Hungary. You have probably Erdogan would be classified in Greece as a neo-fascist. You have Modi in India. So that all over the world you have a real upsurge of neo-fascism. But along with this, now there is an ideological assault, which, for instance, Elon Musk's remarks and so on typify. In India, for instance, now people are openly saying that there should be a 90-hour week. Can you imagine someone actually saying a 90-hour week? I mean, something which the world has really kind of even abandoned talking about 100 years ago. So everywhere you actually have this assault on the working people, and I believe that is really the shape of things to come. Because, as I mentioned, rearmament in Germany, rearmament in Europe, Trump giving this kind of, Trump imposing Pax Americana on the world as a condition for peace, attacking Yemen, using Israel as a kind of, ally to dominate the entire Middle East. All of this represents a different scenario from the immediate post war one. And I think this is also being sustained by an attack on thought, an attack on universities, because you just see what's happening. I'm currently in the US, and I've just come back from Columbia, where I had to give a lecture. And the amount, the students are not cowed down, it must be said, it was fantastic. But on the other hand, the effort is to cow them down. And what is more, the effort is to cut funds to Columbia until Columbia expels, suspends, takes disciplinary action against students who are showing solidarity with Palestine. I mean, it's just incredible. This kind of thing is really quite unheard of. It is not just McCarthyism; it's worse than McCarthyism.
If you have a conscience, it's unbearable to be plugged into the corporate media machine right now. These outlets are accomplices in genocide, running cover for the war machine. Breakthrough has become the go-to outlet for those who want something different. But the funds we've used to start this platform are starting to run out. We'd never dream of turning to mainstream corporate funding. So we're turning to you. Become a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can become an essential part of our fight to not just break through the mainstream media, but create something that can challenge it. We have to become completely viewer supported, or this platform we've built could go away. Don't just watch us, join us. It really is. It's unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime, to have this level of attack on free speech and this kind of witch hunt so openly, so brazenly. And,
Absolutely.
that distinction that you make between the way that, for example, the US responded after the 1930s, which was very, with the idea of Keynesianism, right? Of how to deal with this
That's right.
crisis. Whereas now, that is not how it's being dealt with. They're definitely leaning on very authoritarian tactics, as well as these kinds of fascist movements
Absolutely.
to enforce their side in this very like mobster like way. It's really sickening to watch. But, after Trump's election back in November, you described this kind of global pattern, which is this collapse of the liberal center and this shift
Sure.
towards either the left or the extreme right, depending on, local conditions.
Yes.
So I'm curious, what does that tell us about the current political moment that we're in?
Well, I think the liberal center had been associated with neoliberal policies, neoliberal economic policies. Those neoliberal economic policies have brought widespread distress to the working people. This is true, as I mentioned, I gave Stiglitz's figures for the United States. This is true in Britain and elsewhere as well. As a result, I think the liberal political formations have got discredited. They have no solutions to this. And that is why in many countries, the, as I believe, there is an alliance between big capital on the one hand and neo-fascist elements on the other. Neo-fascist elements exist in every society, but suddenly they are now being brought center stage through an alliance with big capital, whereby big capital gives them financial support, media support. It controls media, gives them media support, and in return, what they do is to change the discourse. They talk. They kind of target some religious minority, some ethnic minority, some migrant group, something, generate hatred against that particular group among the majority, and thereby the whole discourse is changed, so that nobody is attacking the system and the hegemony of big capital, but they are attacking the immigrants, they're attacking the Mexicans, they're attacking the Muslims, and so on. So that is what the neo-fascist groups are doing, and that is a phenomenon which I think is spreading all over. And I think that is the shape of things to come. But then I believe that the neo-fascist groups too would be incapable of resolving the crisis
Mhm.
because of the reason I mentioned, the globalized finance capital versus the nation state. Even a neo fascist government heading the nation state would not have the capacity to overrule the dictates of globalized finance capital and to bring about large government spending even for armaments purposes. I mentioned that Germany is one country that is trying something of that kind, but we're not sure to what extent it will be acceptable to globalized finance capital. That's something which the two political parties trying to form a coalition are currently talking about. But to the extent that the neo fascists too fail, then because obviously the crisis cannot be resolved within neoliberalism, it is only the left that can go beyond neoliberalism, and that is why the coming of the left to prominence is something which, to my mind, is what is going to break the current deadlock that capitalism has got itself into. So the collapse of the middle is understandable. The turn to the right, in most cases because the left is still disorganized and so on, is something which is natural. But the failure of neo-fascism and the re-emergence of the left as the way forward is something which I'm looking forward to.
Well, that's a really positive spin that I like to hear, because I think sometimes, those of us on the left feel like we're just up against this tsunami. And we are up against a tsunami, like you said, where capital has placed these neo fascists center stage and they just have all the resources in the world. However, you're right, they're absolutely going to fail because they're not offering anything that will fix the
Exactly.
problems.
Exactly.
So that brings us to what I wanted to ask you about next, which is, you cite this very renowned Marxist philosopher, George Lukács. I'm probably butchering his name, but what he said, which is very important, is that even the worst socialism was better than the best capitalism. And you applied this to the militarized deportations we're witnessing right now under Donald Trump, arguing that capitalism, not just Trumpism, as the media
That's
is framing it, but
yes.
capitalism is actually
Yes.
to blame. So, can you explain why this distinction is so important?
You know, what we had, again, I go back to my youth in Britain, you know, that capitalism appeared to deal with people in a humane manner. At least people who were located within its kind of borders. True, it was bombing in Vietnam and so on. But on the other hand, say within Britain, within America, it tended to treat people apparently in a humane manner. What you now have, you see, Indians who tried to migrate to the United States were actually sent back, deported back, and they were deported back chained. They were actually in chains in a 40-hour plane ride in US military aircraft. They were actually chained all the time, and they were brought back to India, which is inhumane. Now, even if you look at countries like Britain, what is Britain doing? Britain is saying that we shall actually send our deportees to an African country whom we would be giving some money so that they accept our deportees. In other words, everywhere there's a kind of inhumane treatment of immigrants, which is really quite shocking. I mean, and I think it is just literally quite shocking. It's another thing that the neo-fascist Indian government doesn't raise much noise about it because they want to curry favor with Trump. But it is really quite shocking. And I think this is something, you know, I mentioned that the worst socialist country that George Lukács mentioned is better than the best capitalist country in two ways. First, this kind of a hatred against the immigrants was never encouraged. Certainly not officially encouraged. It may have been in people's minds and so on, that's separate, but it was never the official policy. On the contrary, the government would come down like a ton of bricks against anyone who actually expressed racial prejudices in public and so on. And the second thing is that all the old socialist countries, Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, were countries that were marked by full employment, that were marked not just by full employment, but even by labor shortage. Because of which, you see, unemployment is the progenitor of fascism, is the progenitor of this tendency of generating hatred against the other. So that did not exist because these countries were absolutely full employment, and what is more, they provided the most gigantic welfare states as far as the working people were concerned. It is true that they were characterized by a certain constraint on political rights. They were characterized by one-party states and so on, which are things which socialism must transcend. But on the other hand, in what it did achieve, we should see the positive features as well.
Yeah, indeed. And I want to come back to the issue of which you've mentioned a few times, the issue of these neo-fascists. You've long argued, even before Trump was elected for the second time, even before, that neoliberalism creates the conditions for neo-fascism.
Right.
And you've alluded to that a bit. Can you explain how this dynamic is playing out in the U.S. today? And I guess to take it even further than that, is Trump a fascist in your view?
Well, I would let us look at certain obvious features of fascism. In the 1930s, these features were there, and these features are being reproduced today in many countries by neo-fascist formations. Not all of them are absolutely identical. I'm not saying that this is the all these features characterize necessarily every country to the same extent, but these features are there. One is, of course, the repression of democratic rights of people, which even in the United States now, at least it has been shown against kind of those who are green card holders, those who are visa holders, and so on. They have been deported, and they have also been um, kind of uh, criminalized and so on. I mean, like Khalil, for instance, has not yet been deported, but is kept in a detention camp in Louisiana. Now, this kind of thing introduces fear among the others. Therefore, repression is being let loose currently on the academia, but I think that is just the beginning. Okay, even in the US. And elsewhere, of course, it's pretty clear. Say in India, you have large numbers of student activists or opposition leaders and so on who have been jailed or threatened with jail. The second feature is that, quite apart from state repression, you have repression by fascist groups and fascist thugs and so on. Now, that is something again which you do find in India, you find elsewhere as well. Uh, may not be not to the same extent as we find in India, but nonetheless, you find all kinds of vigilante groups and so on. The third feature, which is very important, is the very close nexus between monopoly capital on the one hand, big capital on the one hand, and the fascist groups. That is an absolute phenomenon you find everywhere. And of course, in the United States, in the most clear way, because people are talking about a bunch of billionaires around Trump. Including Elon Musk, currently the richest man, and an avowed fascist himself, in his outlook, in his political ideology. He is actually, he has even familial links with the Nazis of the old period. So you have therefore a very close relationship between monopoly capital, big capital, and the fascist groups. Within this, you always also have a close relationship between a new segment of big capital and the fascist groups. This is something which was there in the 1930s when all the armaments manufacturers and so on, the new fascists in Japan, the Shinko Zaibatsu, not the old Zaibatsu, they are particularly the favorites of the fascists. So all that you find, and then of course you find this building up of a certain cult of personality, where the nation is identified with the leader and so on. And even these slogans like America first, India first, very, very reminiscent of Hitler's slogans about Germany.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.